Hello, everyone. What exactly is the traditional role of women in the Orthodox Church? This question is one that can be controversial, and attempts to answer it by referencing early Christianity are often short on solid scholarship in service to the church. And the subject of deaconesses is a significant lightning rod for this issue at the moment. So to help us with this problem, I've invited my guest today, who is a researcher precisely in this field. Presbytera Dr. Anysia Metrakos is a scholar of late antiquity, focusing on the patterns of sanctity of Christian women in the early church, especially on the role of asceticism in transforming the place of women in Christian society and in transforming society itself. She's going to be teaching the online class, Holy Women of Byzantium, for the Orthodox Studies Institute in October 2024, and you can go to orthodoxstudies.org/courses. And that link is going to be in the description of this video to sign up and check it out. So Presbytera Anysia, welcome.
Thank you, Father Andrew, for having me.
It's good to have you. So I want to begin with a kind of high-level general question to help us sort of get into your work. So how would you describe the state of scholarship right now on women in the early church?
So before we get started, I just want to say that as a historian, I will be approaching this discussion from that perspective. I will be situating most of my answers in the context of Roman law, and so not really from the perspective of contemporary Orthodox theologians or et cetera. So just as a little caveat there.
Yeah. So basically, you're an academic doing academic things. Yeah.
Right. So regarding the state of scholarship on women in the early church, so since the 1970s and the emergence of women's history and social history, there's been a tremendous scholarly interest in women in early Christianity. And interestingly, many of the topics that earlier scholars pursued are still being pursued today, but just in different venues or different avenues or perspectives. So like the work of Elizabeth Clark or Susanna Elm and Peter Brown, which they really brought to the forefront to the Christian ascetic movement, and just how countercultural the practices of renunciation and perpetual virginity were for the early church, were in the early church for the larger Roman society. Their work now serves as a jumping off point still for many of the scholars interested in Christian asceticism and women in the church. And one of the enduring trends in scholarship on women specifically is a focus on specific individual female ascetics and monastic founders and the communities they organized. So major translations of the lives of female saints from Greek and Latin into modern languages, beginning in the 80s up to the present, have bolstered new and continued interest in the lives of holy women and their reception both in antiquity and into the later Byzantine period. There have been entire conferences and embedded volumes dedicated to extraordinary individuals like Melania the Younger, for example.
Yeah.
So it perhaps maybe originated in the 80s and 90s as an interest in simply giving voice and drawing attention to the existence of the lives of these holy women, has transformed in the last couple of decades into using the very sources on their lives. So their hagiographies, letters, historiography, the writing of history, and also other literary sources like hymnography and even material culture, sort of as windows into their world and the larger sociocultural, legal, theological, and political shifts that happened both during their lives and at the time of the composition of these sources, and also how their veneration factors into discussions of these different developments. So in terms of my own work, my dissertation and now my book project frame a discussion of Justinian's legal reforms on monasticism in the church, which actually benefited women in monastic communities. So I'm framing this sort of legal discussion around the 6th century Greek life of Matrona of Pergi, who was a 5th century aristocratic matron and later abbess in Constantinople. And I use this hagiography as the touchstone to speak about broader cultural and legislative changes which are referenced in the life.
Yeah. So, I mean, for those who may not remember, Justinian is a 6th century emperor of the Roman Empire. And I mean, in a lot of ways, it's kind of a high point in terms of state-church relations, right? Not necessarily
Absolutely,
high. Yeah, not necessarily high in terms of that it always worked out and was great, but rather like this was the empire being super interested in the church and being very engaged in church life. And so legislation is literally regulating the lives of not just priests and bishops, but minor clergy, monastics, and everyday people, because they don't have any sense of separation of church and state. at all.
Absolutely.
It's just not a thing, just not a thing, which I think is important to remember because it's easy to judge earlier periods by the values of our own time, but which is good on a certain level, right? Like if we're getting something right that they were getting wrong, that's cool. But if we decontextualize what's going on, then we often misread it as well, right? So yeah, so let's get a sense of like how Christianity actually transformed women's worlds in the early church. I mean, you mentioned, for instance, the rise of perpetual virginity, which that's not a thing in the ancient world. Like women don't do that except for maybe a handful of people super involved, like in being priestesses or whatever. And usually, though, it went the other way. It was that they were the opposite of being perpetual virgins. So yeah, but so paint us a picture of what the place of women was when Christianity first came on in the scene in the Roman Empire. Like when Jesus is born, when the apostles are around doing their thing, what is the status of women in the Roman Empire in particular?
Yeah, so as an important little caveat here, when we're talking about women in antiquity, unless specified otherwise, we're almost always talking about freeborn, typically upper class women. And this is significant because your status at birth was like the determining status regarding your
Yeah,
representation under the law. So enslaved women had essentially no rights. They could become free, and freed women in Roman society made up a separate and distinct legal category and exercised different rights under the law than freeborn women, depending on the exact time period. And this will become important later on when we're discussing Justinian's monastic reforms, because he actually allows enslaved women complete freedom if they want to join monasteries. And
yeah.
their, masters, enslavers have no say in that matter. So just
Wow.
just to kind of throw that out there, something
Yeah, yeah,
to,
yeah.
we'll mention that a little bit later. But anyway, speaking in general terms about, these freeborn Roman women, something that often surprises people is that women in the Roman Empire actually had more legal rights to property ownership than women in 19th century Britain.
Oh, wow.
In Britain, up until the Married Women's Property Act, any money or property that a woman had became the property of her husband once she married. So whether it was, her personal wage, inheritance, gift, etc., by law, her husband was permitted to dispose of it at any time and could even will it away at his own death. So
Wow.
very different in the Roman world. So Roman women could own independent property. However, prior to Constantine's legal reforms, which followed the legalization of Christianity, so prior to this, women in the Roman world held the status of minors under the law. So they were held under a perpetual guardianship, first by their fathers and later by a male guardian, who was not their husband, but a male relative.
Hmm.
Uh, so according to the law, though, of 12 tables, so this is prior to Augustus, women could inherit property equally with their brothers. So there was no primogenitor. And after the passing of their fathers, all legitimate children would inherit equally. So this is, quite important.
Yeah.
The only
And I
real
was going to say, I
difference.
mean, this is definitely not the, I think, stereotype that a lot of people have about women in the ancient world. If I had to summarize what I think most people imagine is that women are basically regarded almost as property, period, until sometime in the early 20th century, everywhere and always. But this is obviously a much more complex picture early on.
It really is. And so even though so young men, when they reach maturity, could essentially, dispose of their property more or less as they wish, depended on the time period. Women had to do so with the consent or assistance of like a guardian. However, this begins to change under the Emperor Augustus, who does away with guardianship in the Lex Julia and provided
Right.
women but provided women had at least 3 children who survived infancy, 4 if she was a freed woman. So if they could have 3 children who survived infancy, they could be freed of this guardianship and could dispose of their property as they saw fit. This is called like the jus librorum. So something else, though, Augustus did, however, that was forbid unmarried persons from inheriting property. And this is really significant when we start to discuss early Christian ascetics under the law. So they could not inherit, and married individuals without children were also penalized, not to the same extent, but still. And
Yeah. I
so
mean,
unmarried and childless men that also too could not hold significant places in government, for example.
yeah.
So
I mean, this makes
um,
sense. This makes sense, right? If you look at kind of how ancient Romans almost like they venerated family, like the sense of, I mean, this is true, right? Without families, there's no civilization.
right.
There's nothing. And so, but they absolutized it in a way that's as you're saying, it's basically outlined in the law in terms of where does property go? Well, it's going to go with people who are perpetuating the civilization.
Right, exactly. And also significant to mention is that mothers at this time, so first century, had no legal rights over their children. So their children were a part of their husband's family and not their own.
Yeah.
And this was particularly problematic if a woman's husband died and her children would be placed under the guardianship of her husband's relatives. So if she was married off to someone else, she was, essentially really separated from them. It was very difficult. So this begins to shift in the Roman culture around the 3rd century. We start to see a new emphasis on the nuclear family, as opposed to this, like the larger umbrella of the paterfamilias. And mothers take a more active role in directing their children's lives and appointing guardians for their children following the passing of their husbands. And I believe at this time they can even appoint their own brothers as guardians for their children. It doesn't have to be someone from the father's family. And this new emphasis on the family and increased importance in the role of mothers is formally recognized by Constantine in the 4th century. So just after the legalization of Christianity in 313 and 316, he obliterates the Augustan laws we just mentioned. He disposes of guardians for women. He institutes something called the bona materna, which allows mothers the rights, more rights over their own children and property. And he also allows unmarried and childless people to have equal shares in inheritance and social position.
Wow.
And this all impacts the ascetic movement. So marriage is no longer privileged or necessary, either to participate in society or to receive inheritance. And unmarried ascetics could now receive their inheritance and dispose of their property as they pleased. They could, bestow their wealth on the church, on church building, monastery founding, the poor, etc.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, that's really revolutionary. And if you think of how that affects the kind of the very structure of society itself, like where do the resources go has a huge impact on what your family life looks like, the kind of decisions you make, what survives from one generation to the next in terms of the identity of the family. Yeah, I mean, that's huge. And it's interesting. I mean, this is the first Christian emperor. The stuff he does to legalize Christianity is often talked about, but these kinds of decisions are in some ways more fundamental to society and more far-reaching than simply you're allowed to go to church now and not required to throw incense to the cult of the emperor or whoever else, well, I mean, at the same time, right, you get early Christian monasticism, which is like, if it's easier, if you can take your stuff with you and put it into the monastery, you're more likely to do that. You're more likely to join the monastery than if you have to leave it all behind. And like thinking about the implications of this, let's say you're a wealthy person who has a lot and you're like, well, I want to go become a monk or I want to start a monastery. You can take that with you and it benefits the monastery, but you do still have stories like St. Anthony the Great, right? Who leaves it all behind and then just goes out into the desert to be by himself because he's not starting a community. A community forms around him, but he's not out there to start something. He's out there to be away from everybody else, right? And so I think, like when Christians, especially Orthodox Christians, think about the rise of monasticism, it's images like that are the sort of the primary image in our minds of, okay, I'm leaving it all behind. I want to go out into the desert. Although, I mean, if you read the life of St. Anthony, that he goes back to Alexandria to go help deal with problems. He didn't just say, forget you people in the city, I'm done, he goes back, and of course, as we know, a community forms around him. But anyways, I mean, that's the image that we have is people going out into the desert, leaving everything behind. It's countercultural, anti-civilizational, all that kind of stuff, right? But there's actually a bunch of other kinds of stories happening at the same time. So what are some of the other kind of less told stories if someone's going to have a fuller vision of the rise of monasticism in 4th century Christianity?
So there's a lot of really interesting stories. I know we'll get into women more in a minute, but the one I wanted to bring up is that there's actually an entire phenomenon of urban monasticism that's equally interesting, where ascetics are leaving kind of the hinterland and the countryside and coming in large groups to cities to preach and beg for alms. And this is a huge thing in 3rd century Syria. It's an entirely independent movement of celibate ascetics who wander between cities and towns. And they're known for rejecting manual labor, relying on begging, And this movement came to a head in the late 4th and early 5th centuries with the Akomatai, or the sleepless ones, who followed the wandering ascetic Alexander, who was a saint, out of Syria to Constantinople, where they essentially camped out in upper-class neighborhoods and prayed out loud continuously, day and night, in shifts, and would sort of beg for their daily bread. And this movement was very unpopular with local bishops who wanted to keep these ascetics in check and worried that these monks would kind of compete with the involuntary poor of the city for much needed alms.
Oh, wow.
And anyone interested in this topic should read Daniel Kahner's really fascinating book called Wandering Begging Monks, where he sort of parallels the different ascetic and early monastic movements in Egypt and Syria, showing that they're actually very two distinct movements. But
Yeah.
but
And you
yeah,
have
at
to,
its heart, yeah,
I
yeah,
was
go
gonna say,
ahead.
you have to imagine, I mean, with like a movement like that, number one, as you mentioned, these people are frankly competing for alms with the local poor that are not ascetics or whatever, although being poor is an ascetical thing. But also that, you know, if you're a bishop, right, and suddenly you've got all these guys begging for money, not only is that a resource question, right? Like there might be more money that's not then going into regular church life, but also I'm sure there's a certain authority issue there too. Like, okay, well, there's these people that are regarded as being holy that are in the neighborhood now. What does that mean in terms of their relationship with the authority of the bishop, this kind of charismatic figure at the same time? And I mean, obviously this doesn't really last. Like we don't, I mean, there's a handful of sort of holy beggars that are around now, but not these organized groups anymore.
Right. We're talking hundreds in terms of the Komitai, very large. They ended up getting land and establishing their own monastery once the emperor kind of cracked down and instituted
Yeah.
some laws to kind of stop this. But
Yeah. Sort of domesticates the whole thing.
yeah, I think the Council of Chalcedons put in a couple canons to kind of kind of curb some of
Yeah.
this activity.
I mean, I get it. You know, like if you're a bishop, you're trying to keep order in the church.
Yeah.
One or two guys around, okay, but like hundreds of them, that's a disturbance. Understandable. I mean, there's this kind of wildness, I think, in some ways, in this period, you know. Society is reordering itself. So all kinds of interesting things are going to happen on the margins. And sometimes the margins are going to come into the center and challenge the center and
Yeah.
say, what are we doing, you know? And eventually the church has to figure out how to value this, how to keep it, but in a way that's going to be edifying for all and not, you know, disruptive in a bad way. So yeah. Okay, so like, I mean, it's clear that there were some very countercultural people, St. Anthony, these unsleeping movements. But there's also an asceticism that's particular to Christian women in the Roman Empire that transforms the Roman Empire because of the place, particularly of women, right? So can you explain like how that worked? Like how did the transformation happen? What are the shifts that occurred in society as a result of women becoming ascetics?
So a lot of factors kind of come into play here. And one is the increasingly important role of women under Roman law. So I mentioned a little about, we were discussing Constantine and the Bona Materna, but there's also other highly significant cultural and legal shifts regarding betrothal and marriage, which gave precedence to the bride over the groom and ultimately bolstered the potential and social standing of young women in the later Roman world. So, for example, if a young man broke off an engagement, prior to even establishing the engagement, he had to give an enormous gift of wealth to the bride. And if he broke off the engagement, she could keep it and dispose of it as she liked. And depending on the year, because laws shifted, she didn't have to do the same because the bride's family would also give the groom a gift. But if she decided that she didn't want to marry him, in a certain time period, she could actually get that money back and didn't have to
Wow.
have that lost.
So it was
So
so engagement was riskier, and during that
yes,
period,
for
riskier
men,
for men than for women.
yes, riskier for men. So at the same time, we also have this entirely new sort of patristic rhetoric emphasizing the role of mothers and daughters in the salvation of their families as examples, educators, and intercessors in their households. So, for example, wealthy elite Christians in the 4th century were encouraged to dedicate one of their daughters to Christ as a consecrated virgin,
Hmm.
and often from birth. And these young women would be raised differently from their siblings. They would not marry. Instead, they would practice chastity and asceticism within their family homes. And everything about their lifestyle would be a bit different. They would wear different clothing, have a different diet, refrain from entertainments, adornments such as jewelry. And we have letters written by many prominent church fathers like St. Ambrose, Jerome, Augustine, to such families, instructing them on how to raise these young girls as brides of Christ and to keep them, kind of cloistered or separate from the activities of the
Wow.
world.
So you're saying like a daughter in the family is sort of like set aside by the family and raised differently.
Can be.
And she lives a different life from everybody else. Um, she's living this sort of more ascetical life than kind of the normal life of the family in
Right.
preparation for leaving the home, or is it like, is there any sense of she's going to go into some particular institution when she reaches
So
of age?
So not necessarily. It's really interesting. And there was actually a really big issue in the fourth century where families would dedicate a daughter to virginity so that they didn't have to give her an inheritance. Because they thought, oh well, if she's going to take on this ascetic poverty, and then we can give all the rest of our money to our sons who are going to have children.
Wow.
And so you have Saint Basil, all the other saints cracking down and saying, absolutely not. They have to
Wow.
get their full share under the law. And then you see some of these women, after the passing of their families, will establish within the family home like a convent, basically. Um, so we have in Rome and Constantinople and elsewhere across the empire, wealthy, prominent widows transforming their homes into these women's ascetic communities. So sometimes consecrated virgins could join these, or they could establish a community around themselves. So these communities would gather around usually like-minded female relatives, so
Mm.
sisters, daughters, and nieces. And they would also have around them their own servants and slaves who could also take vows of chastity as well. So prominent examples of this include the community of Albina and her daughter Marcella in Rome. So Albina is famously the spiritual mother of Jerome. And we have Olympias the deaconess in Constantinople, who was a patron of St. John Chrysostom. And she had around her a large group of female relatives who also decided, some widows, some virgins. And four of them were deaconesses along with her to build a community for themselves. And then we also, of course, have very famously St. Matrona, the sister of Saints Basil of Caesarea and Gregory of Nyssa and Cappadocia. And Macrina's family monastery also included her brother, and sometimes these communities could include male relatives, but
Hmm.
were still and rather remarkably female-led.
Yeah. I mean, this reminds me, I don't know if you've heard of this, but in early 20th century Lithuania, there was a priest named Father Pontius Rupishev, who was a disciple of St. John of Kronstadt. And Father Pontius was a very holy man. He's not been canonized, but probably should be. In any event, so there were these three sisters who lived in Vilnius. They were Russian. They were part of the Russian minority, and I can't remember if they were widows or what. But in any event, the three of them kind of pool their resources together, and they start this community at a place called it's called Minishkis in Lithuanian and Miknova in Russian. So some people might have heard of this, and they get Father Pontius to start coming to the community over and over again. Eventually, he lives there, and they gather relatives initially, and they're doing church services every day. They have common labor. It's not a monastery, like no one's getting tonsured or putting on habits or anything like that. But it is very much like almost like a family monastic life. And eventually, other people who are not related to them move in, but then they're regarded then as being brothers and sisters as well. And actually, it's a kind of a fun detail that so Father Pontius dies before the communists come, but when the communists take over Lithuania, and of course, communism is very anti-religious. People having church services every day would be very suspect, right, to communists. But because the Minishkis community, they registered as a collective farm, which was a category the communists knew and loved, and because they were incredibly productive, apparently, they basically were left alone. And so,
Amazing.
yeah, it's such a cool story that I wish more people knew. But yeah, there's some interesting stuff. And again, within the context of this upheaval of society, this group of people band together based initially on these three sisters and form this religious community, which in many ways functions like a monastery, but isn't technically a monastery.
So going back to some of these like earliest monasteries, we have some of these prominent women just Paula the elder and her daughter Eustochium, Melania the elder and younger, would leave Rome and found monastic communities elsewhere in the Holy Lands. And these women achieved a celebrity-like status for doing so and were hailed and venerated by their relatives and
Mm.
friends in Rome, with whom they stayed in close correspondence. And so these ascetic women exemplified a level of personal freedom, previously unthinkable for Roman women. Certainly, we're talking about some of the wealthiest of the senatorial classes,
Yeah.
which doubtless contributed to this independence. But we have women, leading ascetic movements and communities, sometimes leaving their homes and even their families to do so, with bishops, clergy, patristic writers corresponding with them, asking for their intercessions, advice, and patronage. And it's these church fathers who document and kind of uphold their lives as legacies and models of female Christian piety. So under their pens, these holy women transform into spiritual mothers with authority over new spiritual children, which paved the way for like abbesses and larger monastic communities in the 5th century. And it's important to note that civil laws and ecclesiastical canons were developed in support of these roles and protected the property and bodies of female ascetics. So if a woman decided to dedicate herself to Christ, she was protected by law from forced marriage. Her property could not be confiscated, and she could confer it upon a monastery, a bishop, or how she chose. And Justinian's novels, as I mentioned, go so far as even to protect runaway slaves from who desired a religious life, monastic life. They could essentially earn their freedom by joining a monastic community, regardless of whether or not their masters were willing. And this is kind of radical.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, usually to be released from slavery, you have to buy your way out in one way or another, in the ancient world. I mean, obviously the American context, that was not a thing.
Right.
But in the Roman world, you could, I mean, because a lot of slaves were debt slaves. So, once the debt's paid off, then you can be free again. But yeah, okay. So you mentioned a number of women like becoming really leaders, such that even bishops and so forth are regarding them as equals, treating them as equals in any event. So, I mean, the traditional understanding of women in the early church is that they were not being ordained as clergy, right? Although I know that some people would look at some of the stories you mentioned and say, see, like pointing at that and saying that's clergy, right? And so there are some today who say that traditional view of women in the early church and the relationship to ordination, that needs to be revised. That's not actually what was going on. We sort of lost some earlier tradition of women being ordained. I mean, is that true? Like, was there ordination of women in the early church?
So there's a kind of a lot to unpack with this. So the short answer, I think, is yes. So the order of deaconesses up until about the 12th century is really well attested in sources. The where and how they function is really interesting and differs across time and space.
Okay.
So just up front, their responsibilities were inherently different from deacons and were largely non-liturgical. So the original purpose, as mentioned in the 3rd century text, the Didascalia Apostolorum, was to assist in adult female baptisms and to minister to women who were within women's quarters of private homes where male clergy could not normally go. However, with the decline of adult baptisms by the 6th century, we see a gradual decline in the office of deaconesses in the Western Empire. They continue to function in the Eastern Empire, but primarily within monastic contexts. So beyond the 12th century, there's no longer any kind of evidence for ordination, though the title still appears. But in terms of actual ordination service, there are 2 surviving Byzantine manuscripts. One is the 8th century Barberini Codex, and there's also the Grotta Ferrata, which describe the ordination of deaconesses, as well as there's also a variety of like firsthand accounts, which kind of describe their function within Jerusalem and the imperial city of Constantinople, particularly within the great church of Hagia Sophia. But the ordination texts reveal a sort of a parallel but different service from the male diaconate ordination, both in terms of the prayers that are read and the rubrics. So most significantly, deaconesses were permitted to receive communion within the bema, so behind the chancellery screen, inside the templum, in the altar. But later on, they are forbidden from doing so. But at least in the earlier part of the Byzantine period, they were allowed to do this. However, They were explicitly forbidden from distributing communion. They could not perform in the petitions during the liturgy. They could not participate in processions. Rather, they spent the liturgy outside of the altar space.
Yeah.
So historically, their primary function.
I was going to say, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I mean, I was going to say that, like, probably for some people hearing that there's women behind what we would regard as the iconostasis today, although the iconostasis today goes through a development, but in that space, basically near the altar, that there will be women back there receiving communion. That probably is kind of shocking to some people now. But I mean, one thing which you didn't mention, and is kind of orthogonal to this discussion, but I still think it's important to note, is that there were periods when the empress, the wife of the emperor, where she was being communed behind, at the altar, not at the altar, but behind the templon, behind the iconostasis area, that she would enter in and be communed back there. And so this idea that's just utterly crazy and never happened in the history of the church it's just not true. I mean, we don't do that now, but there definitely were times when that was occurring. And because of the position of the empress as having this sort of, as the emperor himself had a kind of sacramental role, defined very differently from clergy, for sure. But nonetheless, the idea that only clergy commune in that space is not always a thing in the history of the church. So I think it's just worth pointing that out.
Yeah, I've definitely heard
deaconesses were not the only women that were being communed back there.
I've heard colloquially about empresses. I can't actually pinpoint a text. My thinking is I can think of an example, I think in the 7th century.
Yeah.
Certainly the emperor, of course. That
Yeah.
was definitely where he
who's a
communed.
layman,
Sometimes ordained a deacon, depending.
Yeah.
It's really
Yeah.
interesting.
That's interesting.
But
Yeah.
but we also do have women, lighting candles behind this space. So it wasn't as if it was like women were never in that space.
Yeah.
Certainly within monastic context, women would be taking care of that altar space. But the primary purpose, or rather historical function, I would say, of the deaconess was inside the church itself, was to manage the Eunucheum, which was the women's section of the church. And several sources mention deaconesses constituting or leading women's choirs in this part of the church, which would perform during the matin service. So we know that from the Middle Byzantine period onwards, however, we don't see deaconesses receiving communion in the altar anymore. This kind of ceases. And in terms of who could become a deaconess, there were really strict qualifications that were articulated both in civil law and ecclesiastical canons. So there was a minimum age requirement, originally 60 under the Emperor Theodosius, but was gradually lowered to 40 in the Council of Chalcedon in 451. Though Justinian recommends 50s as the minimum, even though it's not, he doesn't require it, but he recommends that anyway. But they had to live in complete chastity, either as a widow or as a virgin. And Justinian's ecclesiastical and monastic reforms in 535, it's interesting. He groups deaconesses both with clergy and with monastics, but predominantly with the latter. Deaconesses were always assigned to specific churches or monasteries. And also, not to keep beating this over the head, but deaconesses also, of course, primarily consisted of these really wealthy, well-educated widows. Or abbesses, nuns who held positions of influence in their communities. And one theory that's been offered is that the title they were called the diaconos, so had the same title just with a feminine article. That this title was sort of given to these women as a way of honoring and also kind of harnessing or sort of controlling their activities within the church. Because deaconesses were specifically under the authority of local bishops, and thus they were not really permitted to act independently. There are, of course, exceptions, right? The Olympias, the deaconess, Saint Olympias, was made a deaconess around the age of 30, which was very, very young. And she also continued to exert her independence and serve as a patron to St. John Chrysostom. So there are always exceptions, but.
Yeah. I think it's really helpful to actually just look at the actual data, with regards to this question, because there's a lot of stuff that flies around, especially these days. So, yeah, I mean, so it's unmistakably true that even if women were not serving as bishops, priests, or deacons, but sometimes as deaconesses, women are still functioning as leaders in the early church, right? Including as deaconesses and abbesses. So, I mean, can you describe what that leadership looked like? I mean, you mentioned some of the functions already, but I mean, how did these female church leaders function as integral parts of church communities? What would be the kind of thing where the average parishioner would say, well, we can't do without her because she does this,
Right, right. So maybe I'll go into abbesses first for a second, and then I'll come into kind of lay leadership. So, it really looked different. Leadership really looked different depending on the context and location, but certainly
Yeah.
female abbesses, particularly in urban areas, could have a great impact on their communities. Matrona of Pergi, who was the center of like several of my research projects, had a fifth century monastic communities, actually had two, one first in Beirut and then in Constantinople. And she had both ascetic and lay spiritual children, including men, members of the imperial family, the Empress Verena being her spiritual daughter. And she had a lot of interesting privileges. She was permitted to anoint people in churches. She taught within her monastery. She taught catechism and literacy to local women. She converted sort of some late pagans in Syria. And she fundraised and courted patrons to build and support her community. So she was interestingly not a deaconess. However, when she wanted to baptize some of her followers, she would call on the local bishop and she would ask him to bring deaconesses to the convent to assist with this.
Hmm.
So kind of give an idea of how she could impact the local community. And then in terms of lay women, we have in hagiography descriptions of lay women's charitable groups that specifically functioned out of churches to serve their local communities, and other sort of like quasi-ascetic groups of married women who would come together, attend church services together, and support one another. And going back to Matrona, this was actually how she was first introduced to a religious life. When she married and moved to Constantinople, she would go with groups of women to different all-night vigils in the city. She would visit shrines of the martyrs, attend feasts, and serve the poor with them. And her particular group was run by a lay woman named Susanna. And Matrona sought and received solace from these women while undergoing difficulties in her life as a young matron, sort of prior to her monastic vocation. So we have these communities of women supporting other women within the church during this period, and hagiography is kind of a really neat way of looking at it because you kind of get a different perspective. Because sometimes when you're reading or hearing these great homilies or reading these discourses from church fathers, the day-to-day sort of activities of your regular people aren't always kind of coming into the
Yeah.
focus there.
Yeah.
So
And there's like clearly there's whole kind of institutions of social life in the church that I think a lot of people are not aware of, right? Like you said, these groups of women that would go to church together, right? I mean, that's fascinating to me. And I mean, obviously we have parallels in our own day. And I think sometimes we think of that stuff, like for instance, if there's a young adult group at a church, right? We think of that as being something sort of invented for the modern world. But people are still people, as you said, like she was having problems when she was a young woman. And here are these other women that are helping take care of her in a way that frankly, that the men in the church probably couldn't do,
right, yeah,
you know? Um, yeah, and also, I mean, I think it's also worth pointing out, like you said, that a number of these groups had charitable work. I mean, that is a huge element of church life now, right? There's lots and lots of sisterhoods at various parishes that's exactly what they're focusing on. And I mean, now we think of it as kind of a supplement to social, uh, uh, you know, social nets that exist so that people hopefully they'll fall through into deep poverty. But I mean, in the ancient world, charity is something that the church kind of invents, you know. Um, and I mean, we hear about, for instance, the Hospital of St. Basil the Great and how that's
right.
sort of created by that. But obviously, there's all these other things going on as well. It's not
Sure.
just a bishop starting a big institution like that.
Right. It's not just, of course, Constantinople. I mean, this is all across the empire: Alexandria, Rome, Antioch. They all have these different groups. And when you hear the word diaconia, particularly, it actually usually refers to like women's service, which is really interesting.
Mm,
It usually appears in like contexts of like women serving others, serving the church, serving something to kind of keep an eye out for, especially in hagiography. So.
yeah. And I imagine probably like if we don't know that these kinds of groups exist and you see something mentioned in hagiography, you may not know it's a reference to something that everybody at the time would have kind of known about
Right.
and would have been part of their life, whether they were themselves were part of it or just kind of knew it from church. Um, you know, yeah, it's easy to miss that stuff because there's not like a Boy Scout manual of
Right.
of all of the institutions that existed at the various periods of the history of the church.
And
Um,
they differ, regionally, locally, etc. too.
yeah. Well, and I mean, there's going to be people with needs always,
Right.
everywhere. And Christianity has always seen a key part of what it does is to help people who need help. I mean, Matthew 25, this is the stuff that Jesus is going to ask us about at the end. So of course, Christians have traditionally seen this as their duty. So I mean, I'm interested in the figure of now, is she a saint? Is she a canonized saint,
She
Matrona?
is.
Okay.
And up until like last year, she didn't even have a Wikipedia page. And
Oh,
so my dissertation's about her because we have a lot of sources on her life. St. Romanos wrote a hymn about her. She has 3 iterations of her life. So the original 6th century text that was written about 30 years after her passing by someone. So she had a women's monastic community that was adjacent next door to a male monastic community of her spiritual father. So a monk from that community was her spiritual child, wrote her life. And so we have this kind of firsthand account of him recounting her life. We have later Byzantine iterations of this life that are kind of shortened, which kind of indicates that she was a popular saint. We know that her monastery existed for at least 600 years because we have new hymns written to her for her feast day that are still being published and shared up to the 12th
wow.
century. So that's really interesting. And then she also appears in several Byzantine like historiographical documents, the Chronicles of Theophanes the Confessor and others, because, and this is not mentioned in her life, which I think is really fascinating, she was a very staunch Chalcedonian Christian. And when the Henoticon was introduced, she fought the emperor and the patriarch, and she's the only women's monastery mentioned as being as like fighting and publicly fighting against him and receiving communion from the patriarch. It was Akakios at the time. And her monastery was punished because of this. But then she becomes this hero under sort of like, the Justinianic Christianity when, the Henoticon is completely abolished. So her life is actually written during that time when all of these new laws have been instituted by Justinian, supporting women's monasteries, or supporting monasteries in general, but particularly supporting women to make these choices. And there's more about her life that's really fascinating. She was one of 2 monasteries in the city where the nuns actually dressed in male monastic clothing instead of female monastic clothing. So they wore black instead of white, which was significant. And this kind of ties into an earlier part of her story. And when she was living, she was like living as like she was wandering through Syria and basically kind of taking on different ascetic identities, like living as an anchorite, for a time, living as a wanderer, wearing a hair shirt. So kind of taking on these different, monastic identities. So, but anyway, she's like a vocal opponent of heresy. So she becomes kind of a hero for that. And why that's left out of her hagiography is kind of a mystery. We don't really know, but.
Honestly, I'd never heard of her before. But it's clear that, I don't know, at some point prior to now, she was much better known than she seems to be now.
And we have her iconography. You can find late Byzantine examples in churches that have like a visual synaxarion painted on the wall. So you'll see her in Serbia, I think even Romania, Bulgaria, some examples. But if you want to read her life, there's actually a pretty good translation released by Dunbarton Oaks. It's free online. It's under Holy Women of Byzantium, I believe. You can find, it's like I think it's 6 to 8 lives that are translated, and hers is one of them. When I did my dissertation, I ended up doing my own translation because there's some things that there's, the Greek, when you're reading it, you can't really just describe it in one word. You need a little bit more space to explain what this means. And so when I read the text in Greek, I was blown away by certain things that I had to like kind of, explain for myself. So I did my own translation, but that one's quite good. So I highly recommend reading her life. It's long too. It's one of the longest lives of a Byzantine female saint.
When is her feast day?
November 8th.
November 8th. Oh, the Feast of the Archangels. So that probably also contributes to some extent to her not being as well known because, there's this huge Feast of the Archangels on that day.
Right. Let me just, now that we say that, let me just double check that.
Okay. That's right.
It's not the 8th. It might be the 6th.
Okay. Yeah.
I think it's the 9th. Oops. Okay. The 9th.
Okay, it's the 9th. All right. Yeah. Well, that's the Feast of Saint Nectarios of Egina, the modern saint. So, I'm fascinated by this, and I think, correct me if I'm wrong about this, or maybe say more, but like my sense is, especially as you look at some of the female saints of the early centuries of the church, that there is this pattern of kind of flipping the world upside down in one way or another, but in a way that ultimately establishes the kingdom, right? So like, the primary example obviously would be the Mother of God. you know I mean, she's a nobody in the Roman Empire of the first century. Not only is she not a man, but she's also not a citizen. She's part of this backwater of Judea. um and then you get these saints like Mary of Egypt as well, who again like just completely flips the script about
Right.
what it is that a woman is, and so forth. And you see it, I mean, you see it in the life, Saint Zosimus, who just reveres her, like even when he sees her, he's venerating her as a saint in the flesh. And it was interesting to me, you mentioned these two details that really stuck out to me about Saint Matrona, which is that she had, not only is that she had a male spiritual child, but that he was a monk at the monastery next door, which that subverts all kinds of expectations, I think, that at least modern Orthodox people have, where you might think, okay, there are female spiritual mothers, but that's just kind of like if you don't have access to a spiritual father, or if you're a woman, then you can have a spiritual mother, that kind of thing. Like there's a sense of like, well, they're kind of stand-ins, but here's a man who certainly there's spiritual fathers in his monastery, but that's not she's his spiritual mother.
What's
Uh,
really fascinating about that, and we also have church fathers too who have spiritual mothers, sometimes their own biological mothers, in terms
yeah.
of like St. Augustine, for example. But with Matrona, what's really interesting is that the previous abbot at the male monastery next door, that was her spiritual father. And so when she leaves Constantinople, goes to Beirut, and comes back to Constantinople with this huge following, now that she's kind of established, she's an established ascetic, he welcomes her back and hands her these male monastic robes for her community, and
Mm,
basically is like, we're going to be not a double monastery, because you have to be careful here, but that they will be kind of related, and that he is the one who blesses her to tonsure her nuns and to be able to kind of continue on in his tradition. So she's practicing probably his monastic tradition,
mm.
uh, which comes from Syria. He was Saint Bassianos, who was a Syrian. And anyway, so it makes sense to me that after he passed, a monk at his monastery, or monks at his monastery, would also turn to her as the kind of the continuation of his spiritual
Yeah.
legacy.
Yeah. Sort of the same spiritual family.
Right,
And
exactly.
it's interesting that, I mean, that dressing in black, that's the tradition that persists
Right,
for female monastics throughout the Orthodox world. There aren't, I mean, maybe there are somewhere some that are wearing white or something else, but they do that. They're just, they're basically dressing the same as male monastics, and they're living
right,
essentially the same life, in most regards. And then the other thing, which, I mean, I think this might be even more shocking for some people, is that functions as this public defender of orthodoxy as
right,
well. That's really fascinating. And I think I mean, it's understandable, right, that most of the writers, the saintly writers that we know, who are explicating Orthodox doctrine and defending against heresy, that most of them are men, because frankly most of them are bishops, and that's the job of a bishop. A bishop is a teacher. And it's only later on that you get figures like Saint Maximus, who's a monk. But that's interesting. It's the same period as when her veneration is really taking off, right? Under the period of Justinian and so forth. I mean, that's fast. I mean, do we have any writings from her, or do we just have sort of testimony
no.
about what she was doing publicly?
Testimony about her, but what's really interesting is that in her hagiography, so one thing I didn't mention, but it's important to mention, is that she was married and had a daughter, and she had an abusive husband.
Hmm.
And so is this community of women that she's kind of leaning on, and eventually her husband, he locks her up, won't let her go to church, and it's becoming, she's being beaten, and she can't bear it anymore, and so these women help her escape, essentially help her escape her husband, and she ends up joining a monastic community for a period of time, and then he kind of disappears from the text. But when she's reiterating to her spiritual father Bassianos her life story, the details that she gives in her first person account are actually rather different than what the narrator gives at the beginning. So it makes me kind of wonder if there was some, who knows, maybe some note taking done, or they wanted to just sort of, hagiographer wanted to share the fuller story when she presents this information to her spiritual father, because he's kind of chastising her, like, why are you here? Why did you do this? Why did you leave your husband? And she explains how unlivable the situation was. And this kind of is probably shocking to some people, like, how could she leave? How could she leave him? Wasn't this her martyrdom? But it kind of goes to show you that there's all different kinds of saints. And
Yeah.
people have very different avenues towards this. And it really describes her husband as being having like insanity. It wasn't just that he didn't like her going to church or, this or that. There's an element of insanity here. And they compare him to, in the text, they compare him to like a Daimyon dog, which is something that comes from Greek mythology. So he's like rabid and
Wow.
not someone you can reason with. And anyway, so
Yeah.
that's
I
kind
mean,
of an interesting.
there, as you said, there's all kinds of saints, right? Like there are people who walk towards martyrdom, and then you have people who flee and do something good, right? Like,
Right.
I mean, I think of, for instance, the parents of St. Raphael of Brooklyn. Martyrdom is coming to Damascus, and they flee to Beirut. And St. Raphael is born there as a result of their fleeing. I mean, his mother was pregnant at the time that this massacre, these series of massacres were occurring in 1860. Um, yeah, I think that one of the things that saints like this, although really all the saints, if you look really closely at their lives, but especially saints like this, I think underlined for us is that it's not about checking off specific boxes. This is what it means to be a holy person, you know, but rather it's accomplishing whatever it is that God has for that person within his kingdom, even if it subverts expectations, because subverting expectations sometimes is what holiness consists of. Now, that doesn't give permission to sin, but that's not what we're talking about. We're not talking about sin, you know, fleeing an abusive husband. Let's just underline this for everybody. Fleeing an abusive husband is not a sin. Let's go ahead and
Right.
say that to people. I think some people think it might be. But
And
yeah,
that
no,
been and just to kind of mention, during her actual life, that was not technically legal under Roman law. You couldn't actually just up and leave your family. The holy women we were talking about earlier who were leaving establishing monasteries, like Paula, for example, they're widows. So they have a
yeah.
different sense of freedom. But when Matrona was a young woman, this wasn't allowed, but Justinian makes that legal. He
Hmm.
makes it legal to kind of to leave those situations, to join a monastery and be
Yeah.
protected where your spouse can't pull you back out.
Yeah.
Uh,
And so
so
now you have figures like her who later generations of women can look to her and ask her intercessions and have her as a patron. Um,
right, she like
we,
paved the way, and then we
yeah,
have the end result in law. It's very interesting.
yeah, yeah. Okay. To try to draw a lot of these threads together, although I could talk, I'm really fascinated by this figure of Saint Matrona. So we could, I'll just say, everybody needs to go read all of your stuff. But yeah, so try to pull all the threads together though, right? So considering all of this history, like how would you assess that the ways of women's pursuit of holiness? I mean, you already mentioned this to some extent, but maybe kind of give us a general assessment. The ways that women's pursuit of holiness in early Christianity, in the Roman Empire, how did that change the place of women? And how did it change society? Not just like change the place of women in society, but change the society as a whole. Like, what's the result, on the other end of a lot of that stuff?
So, I mean, to really sum it up, I would say two basic things. The first thing would be personal freedom. So, Christianity really, for the first time, provided avenues for a life outside of the home or for proper Roman women. So, outside of the traditional role of wife and mother. And that's something that was part of their spiritual vocation. Women could devote themselves to a life in the church. And this was
Yeah,
ultimately protected by law. And they could use their inheritance for this purpose, to aid the poor, the church, etc. Second one would be that Christianity brought mothers really to the forefront of their families as spiritual guides for their children, and also sometimes their husbands. And this was promoted heavily in the homilies, letters, discourses, even in Comia of the church fathers. And as we've discussed, changes in Roman law really parallel this development as women have increasingly more rights over their children and property between the fourth and sixth centuries. And there's also another factor that we haven't really discussed, but is also extremely important and then contributed to the status of increased status in maternity. And that is the established title of Theotokos, the God-bearer for the Virgin Mary in the councils of Ephesus and Chalcedon, which further bolstered the cultural status of maternity and women in general in the later 5th
Mm,
century, and also helped to legitimize roles of spiritual mothers within the church.
yeah. I mean, she becomes the patron of the city of Constantinople,
Right,
such that when it's time to defend her walls, what do? They march around the walls singing hymns to her, not to some warrior saint, with a
right,
big sword. It's to a mother specifically. I mean, talk about turning the world upside down.
right.
What would their pagan ancestors have thought of that? That would have been just completely bonkers,
I mean, it's interesting. Yeah, I mean, the patron goddesses of cities or virgin goddesses, you don't really have mothers who are being held up as like the defenders of cities.
No,
Athena as a warrior, but you know, it's not Hestia or
no, not Hera, or any. I mean, yeah, it's never a mother figure. That's like, no, yeah, it's Athena number one, Artemis sometime,
Artemis. Yeah,
um, but yeah, this idea of sort of the settled woman, that's Christianity's place to elevate, you know. Um, fascinating. Well, okay, so you've mentioned several times your dissertation, and you said book project, which suggests to me that it's not published yet.
no,
Do you have a general date that it's likely to be published, or any? I work in publishing, so I know that these are always big question marks, of course. But
yes, I have a publisher in mind. I've spoken with people. Hopefully by December, I'll have hopefully by December, I'll have a contract. We'll see.
okay,
So I will say in terms of like forthcoming work, I would say stay tuned. I have an article that was submitted this year that'll be published actually on the financing of female monastic communities in 5th and 6th century Constantinople, 4th to 6th century Constantinople. Other than that, I have a lot of projects in the pipeline that'll be coming out gradually. So in the meantime, if you are interested in my work or would like to have more discussions with me, please take my class and then we
yeah,
can meet weekly and discuss.
yeah. I mean, sign up, everybody. I mean, starting. So this is just a little plug here at the end, right? So starting October 8th. So that's just a few weeks from when we're recording this. Starting October 8th and running for 4 weeks on Tuesday nights in October. So October 2024, Presbytera Dr. Anysia Metrakos is going to be teaching the course Holy Women of Byzantium for the Orthodox Studies Institute. And that is part of St. Constantine College in Houston. And you can find out more about the course. You can sign up at orthodoxstudies.org/courses. And of course, if you are watching this on YouTube, the link is going to be there in the description, so you can just click on it and sign up. I mean, I think if you've listened to this, then you're going to learn some fascinating stuff that you probably never heard of before. So check it out, everybody. So, Presbytera, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Father Andrew.
And thank you, everybody, for joining us. And like I said, please check out the course, and we'll see you later.